va pouvoir commencer. Bonjour à tous, je vous remercie pour
Okay,
être
let's start. Thank you for being here today. Thank you to all our speakers. Thank you for all the participants to this roundtable around the topic of the land use. Thank you for the interpreters.
Et je remercierai aussi tout le monde.
And I want to thank also everyone for not speaking too fast, for helping our translators. I'm Amaury Parel. I'm the coordinator for the Observatory at Climate Change, which is an international organization founded in 2015 in advance of the COP21, which seeks to accompany the actors in their strategy to fight climate change. We have several tools and activities. First of all, to inform, we have a portal online, both in French and English, with a mapping and a library. We also seek to mobilize through thematic actors during our summits or regularly during our virtual workshops. And finally, we also analyze with the Observatory, which today publishes its annual Climate Action Report 2020, which also analyzes and synthesizes the actions of companies, communities, civil society in 6 emission sectors. This is both available in French and English. This session is part of a cycle of restitution throughout this week of with the following red thread: has COVID-19 seized up or accelerated the climate strategies? Do not hesitate to consult our website, where you will find the other session tomorrow morning, afternoon, Friday morning and afternoon. Today, we're talking about the use of the land use, rather. This is what we are talking about today. I'm going to hand over to Aude Valade. She's a researcher at the CIRAD, and we've had the pleasure to collaborate with her for the last 2 years. Over to you, Aude. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this section regarding the land use. Okay, we're going to share the screen.
Super. Donc voilà,
okay. This is something that we've been working with Amaury and Antoine at Climate Change for the last few years. And the title is The Local Action to Stimulate the Commitments of International Performance on Land and Forests. We can start with this first slide with the assessment of the gas emission in 2019, around 6.9, about 15% of the gas emission, all sectors included. It's a figure that is increased compared to the average of the previous years. And this reflects an important part of the forest fires. In 2019, there were many, but also that is a result of the deforestation strategy on the world scale. On the right-hand side of the graphic, you can see the evolution, the development over the last 3 decades per continent and per decade. So if we look at the one, we can see that the gains in forests that we observed in Asia and in Europe do not compensate for the lack of or the loss of tropical forests in South America the last decade. Also, we can also notice that Africa went before South America. So we have a total over 4.7 million hectares of forest that we are losing every year, which is quite alarming. And this is a long-term trend. In the more short term, if we look at the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic on deforestation, we have noticed a negative effect with the budget cuts. The fight against deforestation made things more difficult because some of the patrols could not go on site, and several countries have reported of an illegal deforestation in Brazil or in Indonesia, where things were on the rise in the last 5 years. Yet now this purpose, as we can see on the next slide, the difficulty that we have is to try to reach the goals of the international agreements of fighting against deforestation. As you can see on the right-hand side, and you can find this in our annual report, several commitments of international commitments as part of the SDGs, and a lot of them are far from their objectives, except in the deep orange, which is the New York Declaration on Forest. And that was after the Paris Agreement was signed. That's a good news. So part of the commitment has been reached, but the rest still, what is in clear color, still remains to be achieved. Another example is the objective, the New York Declaration, which was planning a decrease of the deforestation, but since the signature in 2014, we've seen a rise actually of 44%. So the result is very alarming. However, some of the objectives which are not so concerning, which was overlapping with another objective of the New York Declaration, which included the restoration of 150 million hectares by 2020, we have managed to count up to 18% of this restoration plan. On a more positive note, there is also the project of the Green Belt, interstate Green Belt in Africa to reforest from West to East Africa. Great Green Wall. This project was partially achieved. We only have 4 million hectares out of the 17 million, but this project gave an impulse to the countries concerned. And if we add up all the actions that were carried out in all the countries that are crossed by the Great Green Wall, we have 17.8 million hectares across the countries. And this project also includes a societal project and to create also employment. It goes beyond the forestation. Now, if we look at the objectives in line with the Aichi Convention, we are far from achieving our goals, but we have moved on the classification of species. However, we are able to point to the biodiversity, which is another trend which was highlighted this year in this annual report. Biodiversity and climate seems to be converging. These were independent goals with conventions from both the UN and Rio. They were separated, and biodiversity stood out in some of these countries' objectives. In 2019, we realized that there was a tendency to include both topics, the Beijing call, for biodiversity during the meeting between the president of China and the French president as a reaction to the US pulling out of the Paris Agreement. So both presidents committed to amplify their efforts on both climate and biodiversity. There were some signs just to show that climate and biodiversity were seen as two connected topics. And it was really with the pandemic and the crisis of the COVID-19 that we've seen this problem arise between what is at stake in terms of health, in terms of environment and animal sake. And as we are seeing now a convergence of this climate and biodiversity taking on a new dimension for the COP15 and 26 for the climate will probably be done together, and that is raising some hope regarding the synergies for the actions on both sides. Another important element of the assessment of the gas emission in the land use is the role of the private companies. Consumer Good Forum was planning that in 2020 there would be a zero deforestation commitment in the chains of value. This goal was not kept. But thanks to some NGOs, the progress was made, at least on transparency of what we know of commitments made. For example, we have looked at the results of some audited companies If you look on the right-hand side, you see the percentages of companies that do have commitments for the protection of forests in dark orange, and in a clear color, those that do not have any commitments. So if we look at all the companies that were audited, we have about 40% of the companies that had no commitment, which was rather alarming. But in some sectors, there's a great variety, diversity in for the palm oil, for example, in some areas, in the finance sector rather, it's up to 68%. Now we have great diversity according to regions, with countries like Russia that has no commitment. The audited companies in Russia made no commitment for the protection of forests. Now, in terms of sectors of activity, the palm oil is the sector that is showing the most commitment. It is the sector that is the most organized with the RSPO, and is a sector that is certifying some plantations when they do respect some rules, for example, for no deforestation. There is a conflict at the moment between Indonesia and Malaysia, which are both large producers, and the EU, which is launching its last version of its document, has planned to completely get rid of the palm oil. So at the moment, there is a legal conflict around this issue of the use of palm oil. On the other hand, Malaysia is aiming at 100% certification of its palm oil production by the end of 2020, something which we will follow through thoroughly. Now, making commitment sufficient? Not necessarily. If we look at the next slide, what we're seeing here, there is a level of implementation and follow-up of companies in their commitments. This is fairly alarming. Out of all the companies that have made commitments, 100% at the top in the dark orange, you can see only very few of them have taken measures to follow through and monitor their commitments. However, despite this feeble action on the chain of values, we do see investments in the area of compensations, of some compensation investment on site, which are growing. In 2019, we had $159 million, which were invested for compensation on nature-based solutions. This is for the society's aspect. Now, another aspect which we put forward this year, which is a trend which we've been monitoring for the last few years, is the importance of the local community for the protection of forests, especially with the community management, which has shown some good results. For example, we are giving an example of Tanzania, out of 20 million of hectares, out of 48 million of hectares, 22 million hectares are in community management. And we've noticed a better health of the ecosystem, which is good for the population and for the land as well. Another example is the Letitia Pact. We noticed a signature last year, and this year they launched an action plan. This is a way to connect the countries around the Amazon basin, and these countries have committed to launch common actions to protect the Amazon forest. And this action plan puts forward the role of the local communities in preserving the forest and in managing the resources. Now, thirdly, 2019, we've seen many legal victories for communities against state action or state inactions. For example, as you can see on the illustration on the right-hand side, in the Ecuador, the recent victory of the indigenous communities who obtained victory in the face of the state because they had handed over the exploitation to a foreign company. So this is a complex sector, is something that needs to probably require some governing and some necessary tools for good governance. I'm sure this is something which we're going to talk about in this debate. Now, to conclude on this And what we have found throughout this year, we have found that some commitments on international agreements have been disappointing. We've seen signs from companies, but still too little practical actions. And now we've seen communities which are really key players on the ground for the protection of forest. I'm now going to hand over to Amaury for introducing the roundtable that is following. Thank you, Aude, for this teaching. Now to discuss around this roundtable, we have 4 speakers, men and women. We have Marie-Ange Kalenga. She's an advisor for forest governance and development at FERN. We have Angelina Davidova. She's a director of the Office of Environmental Information in Russia. She's a journalist also. We have Florence Pala. She's the coordinator of the project Rio FAC, or at the OFAC, if I'm being right, at the Observatory for Forests in Central Africa. And then we have Roman de Raphael, who is an expert manager on the carbon compensation projects at EcoAct. Thank you, Amaury. Now, the purpose of this debate now is to understand how we can go beyond these blockages, which we have identified in this annual report. We've seen that there were some disappointing results. What is blocking? What could help us to take it further? I would like to first ask a question to Angelina. The carbon compensation has increased a lot, and there's been so many projects. But on the other hand, there's a private sector that is showing signs of commitment that are struggling to translate this into action on its value chain. Angelina, what would you say? What is the link? Should we make a connection between the two? How to make the compensation carbon to not go into the greenwashing and just become just words, and for the companies to not be diverted from their commitment on the chain of value, which is very important on the ground. Angelina, could you answer this question?
Thank you so much for your question, and also thank you for inviting me to speak at this event. It's a great honor for me, and I very much look forward to our discussion. So back to your question, before I address this question, I would probably give a very brief outlook of what has been happening in Russia. And as you probably know, Russia's emissions have been falling down over the last 20 years, mainly due to industrial decline and mainly due to the change in structure of Russia's economy. And they've only been moderately growing since 2000. Russia only recently joined the Paris Agreement. It joined the Paris Agreement last year, 2019. And just a couple of weeks ago, it submitted its first NDC, so the climate target for 2030. And unfortunately, this NDC is very unambitious. It actually even means and projects growth of emissions and not decline of emissions, because it says we will cut our emissions by 30% in comparison to 1990. But in fact, if we count the forests and the LULUCF in, we're already down by minus 50. So yeah, unfortunately, it means growth. Now, forestry sector. Forestry sector and LULUCF sector plays a very important role in Russian forests. Around 20% of all emissions are being sequestrated by the forestry sector. Forest sequestration has been growing since the 90s because there's been less activity in the forestry sector and also less agriculture in Russia, unless in some other parts of the world. However, the real challenges for Russian forestry sectors are forest fires, which are becoming more acute with the climate change and the climate getting drier and hotter in Siberia, and also illegal loggings and unsustainable forestry policy. So when we speak, now directly to your question, when we speak about companies' commitments, I have to say that not many Russian companies have these commitments yet, because Russia has just joined the Paris Agreement. There is no domestic system of carbon regulation, no carbon price. So the system of carbon regulation is still being discussed in the Russian context, and the legislation will probably only appear next year. So what the companies are doing, it's either international companies who are working in Russia and who have global targets, including reforestation. So they might have these targets. Or another option could be companies, say companies from the forestry sector, which also work externally and which also sell a lot for exports. They could be interested in having these targets. Many of these companies have been working with various forest certification programs like the FSC and similar ones. And like to speak it, to put it into a wider context, most of the company, like forest companies, they seem to be working more sustainably now than before, and also more openly. However, a real problem are illegal loggings, very often in the far east of Russia, part of Russia which is close to China. And those loggings are being done by smaller companies or sometimes even illegal loggers. And it's even very hard to evaluate the exact amount of those loggings. So in a way, I would say this is still not an issue for many Russian companies. We're just getting there. However, what is also very much present within the Russian context is that many companies are now trying to speak about how they can use forest reforestation programs to offset their emissions. And there can be a serious threat of greenwashing, because this is what many of them are trying to do. They're trying to make the government change the methodology with which the forests are being calculated, like their sequestration ability. And by this, they're trying to make themselves look better. Even coal companies, even steel companies, they all look at their emissions and they say, maybe we could just do reforestation programs. So this is a real threat, but it's not happening yet because we don't have a full-scale carbon and climate policy in place as of now.
Ok, merci beaucoup Angelina. Donc oui, on voit bien le lien entre.
You can see the connection indeed between compensation, carbon compensation, and the SDGs. And what about what was said by Angelina? I don't know if Amaury would like to add to this and maybe talk about the impact. You work at the Eco Act. Could you tell us, Romain, about the impact of the COVID? We found out that the air sector, the air companies were highly impacted. How did that affect what is happening here in the compensation for carbon? Now, yes, two things. We have the carbon compensation and the aviation sector, which had fixed some goals through the CORSIA device apparatus, which is still in place. But what the aviation sector did, I think in Europe, we talk about a drop of 90% of passengers flights. There is a gap here when we talk about environmental transition. Is something that needs to be built. The longer we wait, the longer the drop will be important. The more the drop, a drop of 90% is not something that happens in one go. So aviation sector is facing that challenge. What they had decided before the COVID was to develop a system of carbon compensation that was interesting in a sense, in that many rules had been defined, what kind of projects, from when, from what time could we select a project. It's not just planting trees and counting the trees, it's also being certified by some organizations which are all online, and you can look at them. Verified carbon standard, you can check this. All the documentation is online. It's very framed. It's one of the complex aspects of this sector to finance projects on ecosystems. The aviation sector had purpose to compensate for all the additional emissions to the reference scenario of 2020. For example, if you had decided, I'm just talking, just like that, just to give you an example, if you had 100 units of emissions, and if you had reached 120 units, then you had to compensate for 20 and what the International Civil Aviation Organization did was to modify, to change the reference scenario, so they actually moved backwards. And the impact of this decision was to postpone by 3 years the demand for carbon credit of this sector, which was going to be fairly important. And at least it was going to kick off many projects, despite the fact that the objective was not very binding. Okay, it was that decision. Now, regarding the other sectors, what we have noticed is that regarding the voluntary market, what we mean by all the companies who voluntarily decide to reduce their gas emission in exchange for compensation, the dynamics has been quite important and is ongoing despite the economic crisis. And this is a big difference to 2019 when we had the subprime crisis. So that's the first difference to last year. The second difference is that we have noticed that all these mechanisms have been regulated. We've seen taxation systems that have been implemented. I'm thinking about the Colombian case or Canada, China. And we've seen a number of companies accepting the credits in those countries and certified by the same certification organizations. This is a new trend which we are seeing. If we take the example of Colombia, if you're a company submit to the Colombian tax, you could say to the state, I'm not going to pay as many taxes or less tax because I've bought that many forests or up to my obligation. So this kind of mechanism, which we are seeing increase pretty much everywhere, maybe we are just about to shift and we might be able to move upward. We said that $160 million per year connected to compensation is very little, is not sufficient. As we said, we need to step up. Thankfully, the COVID situation did not put everything down. Okay, thank you for this detailed answer. We wanted to look at the markets, at the companies. In the 2020 report, we also talk a lot about the local successes due or thanks to the communities. We talked about Tanzania. There are many other examples, and I wanted to ask Marie-Ange now. We spoke about changing or upscaling. We have local examples. How do we multiply this potential of local community management? Is there a willingness to enforce this, and how? Thank you, Climate Chance, for inviting me. Thank you to all the participants for being here. I hope we will have rich discussions. Before I answer your question directly, I would like to jump on what you said earlier on the impact of the COVID-19 crisis, especially regarding forests and local communities. It is to be noticed that this crisis has revealed the vulnerability of these communities despite their resilience to a number of shocks. In Central Africa, for example, we have seen a rush towards the forest and more pressure through illegal logging, and also the rush to genetical resources, people looking for miracle remedies against the COVID, and also people from the cities who were just feeling at loss because the food supply was becoming more difficult because of the restriction measures. So we saw people rushing to the forest for resources. Now, to answer your question practically, more concretely, the example of Tanzania, we can find them also in Nepal, in Guatemala, but we cannot really generalize them. There is a need to reinforce the potential of reforestation in regions like Central Africa, in the Congo Basin. All the countries have shown a political willingness to really include this mode of management in their law and in their reforestation programs. For example, in the case of voluntary partnership with the EU, or to include community forestation. We've seen the integration of community reforestation as a mitigation measure. And last year, the sub-region adapted a roadmap for participatory forestation in order to improve the legal frame, the financing, and also the technical support of the communities, and to therefore duplicate or multiply the potential of community forestation in the region. There are many obstacles, and I think that we will not be able to move forward if these restrictions are not lifted. These obstacles, and I'm talking about governance obstacles, I'm talking about legal obstacles. So if the community forestation is not sufficient, we realize that the law sometimes has some gaps. In Central Africa, for example, all the forest lands are either are dedicated to conservation. So what is left for the communities to develop community forests? Not much, really. So there is a need to make it more relevant, to make this law more relevant. On the other hand, a lot of countries have committed as part of the SDGs to use the community management of forests as a way to reduce poverty, but this should also come alongside some investments and real investments. And in that respect, we need to call the EU and other countries which do have partnerships with forest countries, developing forest countries, where most forest lands actually has to be reminded are occupied by these local communities and by the indigenous groups without any real land security for the donating countries. We need to remind them that as part of this green recovery programs post-COVID, it's important to include elements that would, or program or project that would really improve the resilience of the communities, to improve their means of subsistence. But we will need to first and foremost settle this issue of the land security and the right to the land ownership of these communities on their forest, on their lands, which is not yet settled. You mentioned a number of tools as part of Central Africa. I could mention another initiative, an initiative for the forest of Central Africa, which seeks to support governments of Central Africa and help them to have a better integrated and more sustainable planification of the land management. As part of this initiative, local communities do have a role to play and do have the possibility to raise their voices to secure their rights to land ownership. Now, the role of each player is very important. I spoke of the governing bodies and the law and the partners and the programs and the financing, the local communities, which should be in a position to use these tools also to meet their needs, but also the civil society, NGOs like Ferns and others also have a role to play in supporting and helping, and also in watching what's going on to make sure that the law is being respected and that the possibilities that is given to the communities to manage their own land and their own forest become a reality and not just a promise on paper. Thank you very much. Thank you for this answer. Now, to take what you said, you've identified some obstacles both in the economy and in the governance. Do you think that we saw, for example, the initiative of the Great Green Wall? My question really is to make a connection, a link between what we mentioned before with the compensation projects and what you have just mentioned with the local community management. Is it the kind of initiative that would have a scope, media scope? This is both a question to you and to Roman. Is this something that could be a bridge to attract investors and maybe to change the level of the scale? I don't know who wants to answer this first, Roman or yourself, Marie-Ange? Both. You can go ahead, Marie-Ange. I did mention this initiative for the CAFI, which is an initiative for the forest in Central Africa. I also mentioned the help of the EU. I think these are both instruments which could have a lever effect, both on a political and the financial aspect. In both these initiatives, we're really talking about a partnerships between governments from the north and governments from the south, even though the private sector is not as visible, yet it has its place in all these initiatives. There is also a real momentum at a global scale to develop more binding mechanisms to fight against deforestation. You talked about the Amazon, the forest fires. The EU at the moment is rolling out the Green Pact for Europe, which also has an international side to it. And the international aspect would force all the programs of the EU to be climate compatible and biodiversity compatible. This would also be a lever to, to, to help both the private and the public sector better protect nature. And as you mentioned rightly, to realize the connection between the climate crisis and the crisis due to the lack of biodiversity. Romain, would you like to react to this? I'm trying to activate my microphone. I totally agree with what has been said. The carbon compensation should not be a hook for the lack of action of the governments. We need to have binding programs coming from the EU to stop certain products if they are not complying. It could be also some obligation of reporting on the whole chain of values. There's a whole work that is being done around this that will probably help move faster on these topics. And then there is also the actual compensation, but compensation on what we call nature-based solutions, and the sequestration of the carbon is exploding in terms of requests, and we need to find the right projects, especially in countries in sub-Saharan Africa where there's a lot of risks, especially geopolitical risks. So things are not easy there. What we are seeing is a new types of initiative, which before things were being done each individually, but now we're seeing the governments, the states, taking the control of this to reassure all the investors, give him a framework to the project. Just skip all the details, the technical details, and the World Bank, of course, is backing a lot of these projects. So this helps to move upscale and to lead to carbon compensation. Now the good thing would be to link this to other financings. We are still expecting the Green Climate Fund, and we hope that things would speed up so that we can really start on this great green wall. I've heard about this for the last 10 years. We are looking forward to this project really starting and kicking off. Financing remains a key point. Yes. Some countries are going quicker than others. I'm thinking about Mauritania or Senegal, and for others, it really depends on their legal and governing context. At the first obstacle, then everything else follows after that. Sure. Now let's continue on what has just been said. We spoke about the Green Pact, which includes both biodiversity and climate, another connection with a more holistic, multifunction vision. And I would like us to talk about this other convergence aspect of the climate and biodiversity, sorry, which Angelina mentioned, which is a trend which we have noticed, which is really being more visible, and which could be also a way of changing things. So I'd like to speak to Florence maybe now and ask Florence, what do you think, or how do you think that this convergence between climate and biodiversity could change, could be a game changer, through which means or which method or which obstacle to the convergence? Thank you for inviting me to join your debate on a topic regarding the climate, and you introduced me as Marie-Ange mentioned some examples in Central Africa. I do have a holistic view of the region in Africa, and the issue of climate and biodiversity is really at the heart of this issue of convergence. Climate, when it comes to Central Africa, was tackled by the states, and all the states complied to the conventions. They were all very much involved. We talked about the REDD+, which was also another topic for discussion in Paris. Now, regarding the convergence, you know that the 2020 schedule has been unsettled by the pandemic. We were to have a World Congress in June with the post-2020 objectives, but we now realize that everything has been postponed. So now we're saying that desertification, climate, and biodiversity should become one convention to try to reach our goals, and for all the goals to be aligned. Because if each country has their own strategy for each topic, one for the climate, one for the biodiversity, one for desertification, I think the challenge that we are facing now is to realize that climate is really at the heart of the debate. Just to give you an example, for Central Africa, we have a debate regarding not just the countries, but regions, cross-border region, even beyond the Central African region, even sub-Saharan Africa. We realize that everyone has become aware that the climate has an impact on the conservation of the biodiversity. All the activities which are at the border in some corridors are at the border of the protected areas. So all the migrations and the transhumance, looking for new pastures, looking for water, and the variety of the climate shows that there are areas where we are actually talking more of insecurity very often, because keeping biodiversity, the protection of biodiversity is put forward, but we are now lacking resources for these transhumants. And we are now facing another challenge, not just in the area of biodiversity. We have to look for other areas. Transhumance is not just to understand why migrants move to other protected areas. Now, regarding the climate and biodiversity, there will be in the region a need to pay more attention to these discussions on climate. There are new programs, not only on sites, but regarding the landscapes. And we can see now that all the states have to include the issue of climate in their strategic plans. I think they still need to discuss this. There are huge challenges. The financial aspect, of course, is a priority. When we speak of climate and measuring the progress, we're talking about data, we're talking about being able to measure up what has been done, either in terms of gas reduction, gas emission reduction, even though every country provided some references. We are in 2020, between 2015 and 2020, what progress have been made? The pandemic has been an obstacle for the reporting and the data sharing, and we need to know which are the levels of each country. There are some obstacles to really get a a relevant picture of this biodiversity and the efforts made with the EU, with the Green Deal, and the other programs are really focusing on this climate biodiversity, but also the social economic aspects. And if you would allow me, the local communities also have a great role to play. For information, in the Republic of Congo, they adopted at the parliament a new law to give full power to the indigenous communities, the Pygmy communities. Now in Cameroon, we also have this program to improve the participation and the management of the local communities. Marianne spoke of this, of Central Africa, but it's becoming more global. The youth is mobilized. We are in a region with a lot of youth initiatives besides just planting trees. We are seeing youth associations taking the lead to really carry this initiative of climate change. This is for the future generation, what we call the international community, and even with the new program, if we can merge the three conventions, we can really move forward in order to avoid having scattered objectives. But if you look at each sector, we've not really made progress. We're waiting for the post-2020 with objective of 30% for certain areas. How are we going to measure this? So the more we have negative conclusion, the more challenges we have, or the greater they are. So we need to really challenge ourselves and question ourselves for the future. And I will stop right here. Yes, there is a real issue of being realistic in the commitments. This is what we have put forward in our report. So now the question is, okay, let's look at the lever. Now we've identified the issues. Now we need to move onto action. And what you've just said about the role of the local communities is absolutely key. Indeed, Roman, the role of the local communities and the synergy between carbon and biodiversity, something that is being already highlighted in the convention. Yes, it is key. You cannot certify a project without first showing some benchmarks and indicators, especially the consultation of their share stakeholders, which we call the gold standard. This was something that showed, I think, in 2012 or there around. What we want to do is to include the local communities or the NGOs on site. They're the one contacting us rather than the other way around. That's what we are seeing. It's really a bottom-up initiative, which is really interesting and which is what is selling better, if you like, because a company that is going for compensation wants to show that there are other benefits, not just the reduction of carbon. What we have to remember is that we are not just talking about planting trees again without any certification. This is not what we're talking about. What matters is to really have multi-actors and territorial logics. I'm not saying this is perfect everywhere, and the transparency of the projects enables us to criticize these projects. Everything is online. All the documentation concerning these projects are online, and there are periods of public consultation, so any NGO can come and criticize the project. So it's important what you said about the local community. You cannot have a successful project if the local communities are not backing you. So I totally agree. Another point in what you just mentioned is that it's a transparency aspect. Everything can be consulted publicly. Thanks to the NGOs, we have more transparency, and also for all the other projects. This is a real pillar of climate action. Another point which we need to address before we come to a close is the fires. We mentioned the fires, but we have noticed in the last few years large fires in the Amazon region, but in other regions, also in the Congo. I wanted to hear from Angelina, what has been the effect of the multiplication of the fires? It's been covered by the media. How can the players position themselves because of the consequence of the climate change and yet remain in the mitigation, for example, in Russia or in other parts of the world? How do you observe the reaction to these fires?
Thank you for your question. Well, in the context of Russia, I would say the dramatic forest fires over the last 2 years, they certainly had a major impact on the climate awareness in the country. I believe especially last year when all over the media, there were all these pictures of Siberia burning and smoke from those fires reaching Canada and other countries. That was obviously something clear for the Russian context, that climate change is here, we also suffer from it, and we being the northern country, which for many years didn't treat climate agenda seriously, I feel like those particular fires have changed a lot in the climate debate in the country, on political level, but also on the level of the public, like everyone was worried about it. Russia's specifics with regard to forest fires is that it's very often taking place where no one lives. And in that case, if it does not create particular threats for human settlements, then they don't fight with it. And but it's still a global challenge, and it still is one of these feedback reactions when we have more forest fires, more CO2 emissions, and then it's the climate change is getting worse, and we have more forest fires as a result of that. So in a way, I believe in case of Russia and other northern countries with boreal forests, a really big question is how to rethink our forestry policy. What can we do to fight forest fires also in the areas where no one lives? And then if we think about other major areas where forest fires were taking place over the last few years, and those would be Australia and California. I mean, what unites all three areas is that obviously the forest fires are much more intense, the areas are larger, and the damage is also higher, especially in case of California and Australia. Like millions of people have been evacuated. There's been a lot of damage, and people also died, and it also destroyed livelihoods for people and animals. So I feel like there's a big thinking nowadays about how do we go about it, because in many ways, forest fires sometimes happens, as I mentioned before, in forests which are not touched by humans, like in case of Russia. But sometimes, and it's also in case of, say, southern Siberia or Australia or California, it happens in the forests which have been touched by humans. And where humans interfered, where humans cut down one kind of trees and planted other kind of trees, and where humans were trying and experimenting with various forestry management systems. And now I feel like this is certainly a sign that we got to rethink that. We got to rethink how we manage forests. We got to rethink how close we live to such forests. We also got to rethink how we deal with that on the country or maybe international level. Because if something like this happens again, it might also be an issue where international community should start cooperating. Because like the Arctic, like the forest fires, this is something of global importance.
Tout à fait. Est-ce que Florence peut-être ou Marie-Ange voulait réagir?
I don't know if Florence or Marie-Ange would like to add to this regarding forest fires.
Ou pas?
Maybe not, okay.
Marie-Ange?
Oui, alors pour peut-être analyser la situation dans
Maybe to analyze the situation
Portugal,
from other countries in Europe's point of view, Scandinavia, Portugal,
des feux de forêt.
where we did see forest fires.
Quelles sont les pratiques
Basic question was, what are the forest practices and forest management? We've noticed that the forests that are more resilient are the forests which are the oldest,
qui contenaient le plus de biodiversité.
those that has the most biodiversity,
Susceptibles, donc,
and forests that are more susceptible, who are more vulnerable. The ones that are more vulnerable to fires are the planted forests, usually with eucalyptus. And we noticed that there was, if we were to involve the local communities, we noticed that it would be possible to develop a whole range of means to better prevent these phenomenon, which for some are natural. Now in Central Africa, some of the causes might be different, slightly different, yet we did see that in a region between the Republic of Congo and the Congo Republic, a certain number of forest fires. So we should really think about new methods for prevention, to prevent these phenomenon, and other method to adapt, which could be inclusive. That's what I can say regarding this topic. Of course, there is the whole prevention aspect, but the adaptation aspect also, which is very important to make sure that the local communities living close by should be consulted. So we are still coming back to the connection between biodiversity and the health of the ecosystem, and the importance of the management from the local communities. And even on this topic, which may seem slightly different, actually, we're coming back to the same basic and the same conclusion, the need to also have some financing to do prevention work. Now, we do have a few questions from our participants. We do have one question by email. One participant is asking, how should we preserve, on the one hand, the role of the carbon well from some land, sorry, and on the other hand, we're talking more about farming here. Is farming able to both adapt and to mitigate really climate change through farming? That's what the question was all about. Would someone like to talk about this? This is pretty close to what we've just been discussing. I could try. I'm not a specialist in the area of farming. However, we have noticed through our research that many projects actually tend to change the farming methods for a better sequestration in the land through various methods, different technique. I don't think it's impossible to both keep the carbon in the soil and feed the population. And therefore, there is some. It's not impossible. It's not contradictory. It's just a change of practice. It's not going back to old technique, but rediscovering and improving those methods, those contradictory methods, and the farmers can actually get paid for stocking carbon or keeping the carbon in the land. A land without carbon is a dead land that will not enable anyone to feed anybody. So I totally agree with what you said. Another question from our participants, talking about the awareness, the raise of awareness following the pandemic between wildlife and human life and animal life. We've already talked about the connection in terms of climate action. Now, in your areas of expertise, have you noticed a concern and a willingness to act to reconcile wildlife and human life? maybe in conservation forests or plantation forests closer to the population. Land sharing, land sparing, should we share the space a bit more? We leave the wildlife in one place and leave the human life in another place. Would someone like to comment on this? I think Marie-Ange and Florence. Yes, absolutely. This issue of using of land sharing or land sparing, what we have not talked about today is the land use and the conflict which we are seeing between climate and biodiversity, because we want to increase the land spared. We are finding ourselves in this conflict. We want to maintain some spared land, and yet communities need space. So how do we reconcile the two? We need to cohabitate. If we talk about wildlife, urban life, we are together. It's a holistic approach. The pandemic revealed that people would be going back to the rural areas, would be looking at going back to nature to find remedies. We have come to realize that we cannot do without nature, hence the nature-based solutions. It's actually what we were doing before or which we forgot to do. So we need to come back to basics. So the idea of coexistence or co-living, it's like we used to talk before between human life and wildlife. Wildlife has its place. We found ourselves in a conflictual situation, but we need to learn to share the space. We need to learn to live together. Marie-Ange, did you want to say? And it will be our last between we conclude on this. I totally agree. About 2 weeks ago, we organized with the European Parliament a conference on the strategy for biodiversity. And the EU intends to preserve 30%, or at least to reach an objective of 30% of conservation of the land through these programs. We have to be extremely careful that conservation would not match with the reduction of the land of the local communities and would not exclude them in this consultation. These communities have lived there for hundreds of years in those spaces and have managed to preserve those areas, and these populations are the less responsible of climate change and the degradation of the environment, so they should not pay for the bad actions of others. As Florence was saying, there's a lot of local traditional know-how that these populations retain and maintain, and we need to go back to them, go back to the basics to try to better use and better exploit this know-how in the right term. The nature-based solutions should not mean that we should take hold of the forest spaces or of some land to use it for compensation to better produce elsewhere, but this solution should be inclusive and should really place the human being right at the core of the environment. It is not contradictory. The human being is part of the ecosystem. So it would be an illusion to try to exclude the human being. Thank you all for all these discussions. I'm going to hand over to Amaury for the conclusion. Thank you to our 4 speakers for these very interesting discussions. You even went further than our topic. Thank you, Aude, for the great moderation work which you did, facilitating work. There was a good flow between all the topics. Thank you to all 5 of you. I also want to thank all our participants. Also wanted to thank our partners, which have been supporting us for some years now, whether from the private or public sector. And I thank all our participants and for their time. Thank you very much. And we'll meet tomorrow morning again at 11 and at 5. Tomorrow we'll be talking about energy and building, and on Friday we'll be talking about waste and textile industry. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Merci.
Bye.
Merci.